Hi, everybody. My name is Joe Steeb. Welcome to the virtual Mershon Center. I'm a postdoctoral research here. Today, we have a joint event. We have a double jointed event that's hosted by Mershon, the Center for Latin American Studies here at Ohio State, and the Brazil Gateway, which is part of Ohio State's Office of International Affairs. The topic of our event today is democratic erosion and comparative perspective, with a focus on Brazil and the United States. In the last few decades, democracies around the world have undergone different levels of regression, including the rise of authoritarian leaders, increasing polarization, weakening of the rule of law, the undermining of norms, and many other problems. In today's event, we hope to understand how these trends are developing in the two largest democracies of the Western Hemisphere, Brazil and the United States. Both are multiracial societies that have seen increased democratic erosion in recent history. Our two speakers today, excuse me, are Professor Felipe Loureiro and Professor Andrew Janusz. Professor Loureiro is associate professor at the University of Sao Paulo's Institute of International Relations. He's also been a visiting fellow at Brown and George Washington universities. He researches US-Brazilian relations during the Cold War, as well as Brazilian economic and foreign policy history. His latest book is The Alliance for Progress in President João Goulart's Brazil. Professor Janusz is assistant professor of political science at the University of Florida. His research focuses on race and electoral politics in Latin America, with a focus on Brazil. His research can be found in numerous journals, and he is currently working on a book manuscript entitled Race and Political Representation in Brazil. I'd like to thank both of our speakers for being here today. Just for the audience's knowledge, we're going to have each of our guests speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll open things up for questions and discussion. If you have a question, please use the Q&A box at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, and I will relay the questions to the speakers. So Dr. Janusz is going to start us off. You can go ahead and share your screen. I'll mute myself, and you can take it away.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here virtually with you all and discuss this important topic. Brazil and the United States are much more similar than they are different with respect to democratic erosion at the moment. And I think both countries have a lot to learn from each other, and there's a good bit of academic discussion in the comparative politics literature, comparing and contrasting the two. So first, how did we get to this point? Jair Bolsonaro was elected president of Brazil in 2018. Despite having served in Congress for nearly 30 years, he ran as a political outsider. So he's a more marginal member of Congress, didn't really accomplish much. He was most known for making bombastic claims and denigrating different constituencies. Oftentimes he would attack women, members of the LGBTQ community, as well as what he saw as communist leftists. So he was most known for supporting the military and advocating for a return to authoritarian politics. He had previously served in the Brazilian military and had retired as a captain. What's important to recognize is that Bolsonaro wasn't sort of a genius that sort of ushered in this new wave. He was really taking advantage of widespread frustration with politics as usual. In Brazil's two-round runoff, he was able to secure 46% of the vote in the first round and subsequently cruised to victory with 55% in the second round. His election sort of took advantage of widespread discontent and sort of a multi-level crisis in Brazil at the moment. So Brazil, leading up to the 2018 elections, was coming out of a major economic crisis and an economic recession. Violent crime was rapidly growing throughout the country. 17 of the 50 most violent cities, according to worldwide figures, were located in Brazil in 2017, the year before he was elected. And at the moment, Brazil was still sort of dealing with the fallout of a major corruption scandal, Brazil's car wash investigation, that implicated a number of sitting members of Congress. Over 1/3 of the members of Congress were indicted or under investigation. And finally, he took advantage of growing partisan polarization. Brazil is known for having a large number of political parties. They have over 30 official political parties, a number of which are really marginal. And while individuals typically don't have strong partisan ideologies, as in they're committed Republicans or they're committed Democrats, a clear division within Brazilian society is support for the Brazilian Workers' Party or against the Workers' Party. So individuals have strong feelings about the Workers' Party, which had been in office for over 12 years. So while the Brazilian Workers' Party had ushered in a level of economic growth and prosperity, particularly during Lula's administration, during Dilma Rousseff's tenure in office, there had been economic crisis, there had been corruption, there had been growing displeasure with the PT. And therefore, he was able to sort of mobilize around these issues, run a strong law and order campaign that took advantage of growing distrust, displeasure with the political system. So if you look at this graph, I made this using VDem project data. It's looking at liberal democracy. They have a scale that ranges from 0 to 1. As you can see, in 2018, or by the time Bolsonaro was elected in 2018, Brazil was already facing a substantial decline in liberal democracy. Polarization was rising, support for elected officials and trust in government institutions was declining. There was growing sentiment that the only rights that were respected were the rights of criminals. It wasn't the rights of good, upstanding citizens that were being advocated. This is a bit different than the US, where sort of the election of President Trump ushered in this decline in liberal democracy. Both Bolsonaro and President Trump displayed authoritarian tendencies. Bolsonaro was actually outspoken about his distrust or dislike of democratic institutions. He made there were no allusions in his election or prior to that he had these authoritarian tendencies. He actually advocated for a return to military dictatorship, insinuated that the Brazilian government and Brazilian society wouldn't have had as many problems as it was had the military government killed more individuals during the dictatorship. When in office, he then proceeded to attack and further denigrate liberal democratic institutions. So he would oftentimes target the media, just like President Trump, insinuate that they were fake news, advocate actually for violence against different institutions, media institutions, and utilize platforms that allowed him to go around the media and speak directly to members of the electorate. So he utilized Twitter, strongly employed Facebook in order to communicate to voters and supporters, and sort of condemned any claims against him. as sort of fake news that, oh, there was this attack against him, it's unjust, and he's being wrongly targeted. He also attacked the electoral institutions, provoked a lot of doubt in the validity of elections, whether or not they were free or secure, similar to President Trump. Brazil uses an electronic voting system that is rather efficient. Within hours, you know who has been elected and who has not. Bolsonaro suggested that this electronic voting system was vulnerable to hacking, that different nefarious actors, including members of leftist political parties and organizations, might be able to swing elections and cheat, basically. So most recently, he advocated for a return to paper ballots, which would have allowed, according to him, a greater degree of validity and oversight, the ability to audit results, and encourage supporters in Congress to sort of push for changes to the electoral system. He was ultimately unsuccessful, and the courts have actually opened investigations into him and the claims he's made about electronic voting, basically saying, you can't do this, you're lying, these electoral systems are secure and dependable. And when the courts have sort of opened investigations into him, he's proceeded to attack the courts and decrease trust, called on his supporters to take to the streets and pursue activities that are going to damage the court's reputation. So throughout his time in office, despite lots of his authoritarian activities and despite economic crisis and the pandemic, he's actually retained a large amount of public support. I wouldn't say that he by no means has approval of the majority of the Brazilian public, but his approval ratings are by no means in single digits. This is something you also saw with President Trump. While there were a number of individuals that were outspoken opponents and criticized him throughout his time in office, he had relatively high approval ratings, so above 40%. If you look at Bolsonaro's approval ratings, you see here in red, these are individuals disapproving, blue individuals approving, and gray individuals that didn't know or didn't respond. You see, while his approval has declined, he still has upwards of 30% approval, and a small subset of the population is undecided about it. What this means is, depending on how he speaks to his audience, be it through Facebook, be it through public rallies, he can still make the claims that, no, the Brazilian public is behind me, they support me. Any sort of polls that are unsavory or unflattering are just fake news. He can take a picture on Avenida Paulista that shows thousands of people behind him supporting him and make claims about what his real approval is. This is important because Brazil's democracy is still relatively young. If you look at support for democracy or dictatorship coming after democratization, you'd see that 40% or just over 40% of the public was in favor of democracy. Now that's increased, or it had increased the year he was elected, to upwards of 60%. But there's still a large minority of individuals that say sometimes dictatorship is preferable, or say that it doesn't really matter to them whether Brazil is democratic or autocratic. A number of Brazilians would be willing, or more than 50%, according to LAPOP data, would be willing to trade free and fair elections for economic security. So what should we expect then going forward in Brazil's upcoming elections? Bolsonaro, according to all polls, is headed towards defeat. Lula, who had been unable to run in 2018, is going to be a candidate in 2022 and has relatively high approval. All election scenarios suggest that Bolsonaro would lose in the second round. But there's some reason to expect that we might not see the electoral outcomes and the transition of power that we might expect. So for one, Bolsonaro had said if Brazil doesn't switch to paper ballots, there will be no election, that he would stop this from happening. I'm not putting a lot of faith in that option. I think the elections will happen, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the results are going to necessarily be accepted by him. One potential scenario is that he would lose, but he would refuse to leave office. He's already alleged that the system can be violated, that voter fraud is a major issue, and a substantial portion of the Brazilian public seems to be responsive to those claims. So over more than 1 in 4 Brazilians says they have absolutely no trust in elections, which means if he sort of alleges that, no, there was widespread voter fraud, I'm not leaving office, a portion of the public would probably go along with this. Another option is that he might call on the military to defend him and his role in power. He has filled his cabinet and the government with former military leaders or active members of the military, and he might very well call on members of the military to defend and maintain him in political power. And a third option that he might pursue is to call on the military directly to assume power. So he might say, oh, I'll leave power, but really we need the military to step in. This election was not free and fair. The military should take power, and there should be some sort of caretaking government for some period of time. Regardless of what happens, even if Bolsonaro sort of leaves office, which he has already indicated that he doesn't intend to leave. He says the only way he will leave office is via death or prison, suggested that only God would remove him from office. There's reason to suspect that Brazilian democracy will not rebound, just like US democracy hasn't rebounded after the exit of Trump. So President Trump called into question the security of US elections. And if you look at faith in elections while he was in office versus after he left office, you'll see that trust hasn't rebounded. So 12% of US respondents in the America's Barometer survey said they had no trust in elections. After Trump lost and left office, 11% said that they had no trust in elections. Therefore, I imagine even if Bolsonaro leaves, we'll continue to see Brazilian democracy under threat. There continue to be favorable conditions both in Brazil as well as in the US for incendiary populists that are going to appeal to traditional values, say that no, a substantial portion of the population has been left behind. And these appeals are going to resonate with members of the public, just as it did in 2018 and 2016. Finally, what I want to add is that, as Joseph mentioned, this is not just simply a Brazil-US phenomenon. If you look at Freedom House data, you'll see that more countries are declining with respect to democracy than improving with respect to democracy. This is a global phenomenon of deteriorating democracy. And what happens in the US and in Brazil I imagine will reverberate around the world. So Bolsonaro has learned from President Trump about what works and what does not work as far as appealing to members of the citizenry, and has utilized a lot of those strategies. We're seeing other countries and populist leaders around the world behave similarly. And one fear I have is that aspiring politicians will sort of, that are a little bit more savvy, will be able to better utilize these tools to provoke outrage, to take power, and then will actually be able to undermine electoral institutions more fully and entrench themselves. So this hasn't necessarily happened in the US or in Brazil because Congress has acted as an effective check. But in some other democracies, we can imagine that this would happen. So thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion.
All right, thanks very much, Andrew. Really appreciate that. Let's switch over to Felipe. Felipe, you can go ahead and share your screen.
Please, Joseph, tell me if you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
All right, that's perfect. So let's begin here. First of all, I'd like to thank Professor Joseph Thiep for the invitation, Ohio State University. It's a pleasure to be with Andrew in this webinar. So in this presentation, let me just put here. In this presentation, I will explore some similarities and differences that Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro and former US President Donald Trump represent in terms of potential threats for Brazil's and US democracies. I will look into a specific event that took place in Brazil in 2021, the pro-Bolsonaro demonstrations of September 7th, Brazil's Independence Day, in order to discuss how Bolsonaro and his followers mobilized the signifier communism to attack democratic institutions and contradictorily to justify authoritarian measures in Brazil. So let me begin by saying a few words on Brazil's political context. Sometimes I'm gonna repeat what Professor Andrew has already said, and on Bolsonaro himself. So Jair Bolsonaro is a retired army captain who ran for president in 2018, casting himself as a political outsider, despite the fact that he had been in politics since the early 90s as a federal deputy for the state of Rio de Janeiro. His 2018 presidential campaign was launched under the banners of economic neoliberalism, moral conservatism, anti-corruption, and tough on crime policies, including the right for citizens to defend themselves through the acquisition of firearms. As a former army member, Bolsonaro is strongly linked to the army and to the defense of the 1964-1985 Brazilian military dictatorship. Bolsonaro considers that the regime's anti-communist policies saved Brazil from chaos and openly praises its human rights violations, torture and killings of opposition figures, as well as several of its authoritarian measures. The story behind Bolsonaro's rise to power is a long and complex one, and I don't have time here to go into the details, and Professor Andrew's presentation helped me with that, so I'm gonna be brief here. The important point is that it's widely seen by scholars as the culmination of a process of de-democratization in Brazil. To use Bernardo Bianchi, Patrícia Rangel, and Jorge Chalud's concept, or the weakening of the country's democratic rule, which ramped up after the impeachment that took Labour Party President Dilma Rousseff out of office in 2016. And that culminated in the prison on corruption charges of former president and the leader of the Workers' Party, Lula, in 2018. Due to his arrest, Lula was prevented from running for office in 2018, opening the way for Bolsonaro's presidential victory. I need to make a quick parenthesis here on former President Lula. Lula was temporarily released in late 2019 due to a new interpretation of the country's legal code reached by the Supreme Court. And in 2021, Lula's judicial ruling was canceled, and his legal processes had to begin all over again because the same Supreme Court found that the judge responsible for Lula's case, called Sérgio Moro, had acted partially and in collusion with state-level prosecutors. Sérgio Moro, who became Bolsonaro's justice minister, broke with Bolsonaro in 2020 and now is one of the contenders in the country's 2022 presidential elections, which has Lula and Bolsonaro, as Professor Andrew has already showed, as favorites. Parenthesis closed, let me go back to Bolsonaro. After being elected in November 2018, Bolsonaro took power in January 2019, and the process of Brazil's democratization has accelerated considerably ever since. Attacks on the media, minorities, social movements, universities, and political institutions, such as the Supreme Court, to name just a few, have been escalating. Military officers dominate more than 1/3 of the government key posts. Similar to Trump in 2020, Bolsonaro gives clear indications that he will not accept defeat if he loses re-election in 2022. The demonstrations that I'm going to talk about right now were held in several Brazilian cities, including Brasilia, the country's capital, Rio de Janeiro, which was the former capital of Brazil and maybe Brazil's most famous city in terms of the fact that it has a lot of tourism attraction, and Sao Paulo, Brazil's economic engine. So here you have Rio de Janeiro and then Sao Paulo, the demonstrations that took place in September 2021. By that time, Bolsonaro and his main political allies had been inciting crowds for months to come out in the streets to protest against a range of issues. Two matters stood out: the country's electoral system, susceptible to fraud, according to Bolsonaro and his followers, and the so-called totalitarianism of the Brazilian Supreme Court. Let me say a few words on both matters. For more than 20 years, Brazil's elections have been employing electronic ballot boxes, like this one that you sent here. These are offline equipment, allow for swift and auditable vote counting, and have never proven to be amenable to fraud. In spite of that, and despite the fact that Bolsonaro had been elected 4 times in a row as federal congressman and 1 time as Brazilian president using this very same system, Bolsonaro and his supporters have been arguing for years that Brazil's electoral system is fraudulent, prone to favoring the Brazilian left, particularly former President Lula, and therefore the whole system is in need of a structural change. Had not been the system fraudulent results, Bolsonaro say, he would have been elected in the first round in 2018. Of course, that you might remember Trump saying that his vote margins against Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton had not been larger in the 2016 elections because of the votes cast by illegal immigrants. Basically, Bolsonaro and his supporters wanted ballot boxes to print out a receipt proving that the equipment had correctly registered the citizens' votes. With that end, Bolsonaro attempted to change the Brazilian constitution and even blackmail Congress on the day that the matter was being discussed by the country's parliament, August 10, 2021, by organizing a military parade in Brasilia, Brazil's capital. At the end of the day, as Professor Andrew has already pointed out, he failed. Congress refused to pass Bolsonaro's constitutional amendment. Not surprisingly, though, 1 month later, September 7, directly incited by the president himself and by his inner circle, Bolsonaro supporters were out in the streets. The second issue that had mobilized Bolsonaro supporters on September 7, 2021 was the so-called totalitarianism of the Brazilian Supreme Court. Brazil's Supreme Court is made of 11 judges appointed by the president and ratified by the Senate. At that point, Bolsonaro had been able to appoint only 1 out of these 11 judges. As of this presentation, he had been able to appoint another judge, so 2 out of 11. In Brazil, judges retire compulsorily at the age of 75. The Brazilian Supreme Court has become one of the key obstacles against Bolsonaro's controversial and pro-authoritarian moves since he became president. The most divisive issue relates to the opening of 2 investigations by the federal police, instigated by the court itself and not by the federal prosecutor, who is appointed by Bolsonaro, about the organization and the finance of anti-democratic demonstrations in the country, as well as, and this is a key investigation, about the spreading of disinformation and fake news by Bolsonaro supporters. Evidence point that the later issue, disinformation and fake news, had been carried out by a complex web of actors and institutions led by Bolsonaro and his inner circle, including pro-Bolsonaro federal congressmen, pro-Bolsonaro entrepreneurs, far-right YouTubers, bloggers and journalists, and members of the Bolsonaro political staff. The court had issued numerous search warrants since 2019 against people involved in the case. It has also issued arrest orders against federal congressmen and political officials in matters related to hate speech and threatening acts against court members. Bolsonaro and his allies had been arguing at the time, mid-2021, that the acts of the Brazilian Supreme Court represented direct infringements upon the right of free speech, violating the Brazilian Constitution and opening the gates for a totalitarian state. At this point, you should have probably noticed several possible comparisons regarding the potential threats that Bolsonaro and Trump represent to Brazilian and US democracies, respectively. If we replace electronic ballot box for mail voting, for example, we will find a common narrative against Brazil's and US elections. But there are important differences as well. The increasing subjection of state electoral institutions and the molding of state electoral laws by pro-Trump Republicans since the beginning of the Biden administration, including the conservative majority consolidated by the Trump presidency and the US Supreme Court, contrasts with the lack of control of Brazil's national electoral institutions by Jair Bolsonaro, whose basic electoral rules, as we saw, he was not able to change in his favor, and whose key electoral positions are not in the hands of Bolsonaro's allies, but under the control of the judges of the Supreme Court. On the other hand, mainly due to Bolsonaro's army background and conservative political proposals, as well as his narrow corporatist agenda, pensions and wage increases favoring the armed forces and the police, Bolsonaro has been nurturing the sympathy of large sections of Brazil's armed forces and the country's militarized police, something that Trump, especially when it comes to the US military, does not seem to be as strong. Of course, this difference is particularly worrisome given Brazil's and Latin America's long history of military dictatorship and military interference in the political arena. After pushing hard against Brazilian democratic institutions in the context of the September 7, 2021 demonstrations, Bolsonaro decided to back down, and there he remained in the last months of 2021. This year, though, Bolsonaro has come back again with the same attacks against Brazil's electoral system and the so-called fraudulent electronic ballot box. It's difficult to imagine that Bolsonaro will play by the rules during this crucial electoral year in Brazil, especially because his main political competitor is no other than former president and, according to him, communist Lula. This word, communism, is what I'd like to emphasize in the September 7, 2021 pro-Bolsonaro demonstrations. The issues that motivated the protests, the fraudulent Brazilian electoral system, and the so-called totalitarian measures taken by the country's Supreme Court were unified around this major signified communism and were encapsulated into a conspiratorial worldview that ends up creating the rhetorical conditions for an authoritarian regime. Please take a look at these images of the September 22 demonstrations. I'm gonna take just 5 images as an example. This first one says, it is in Sao Paulo, Avenida Paulista, two banners that say, "Let Bolsonaro govern, he represents us, 100% Bolsonaro. God bless Bolsonaro and Trump, set us free from communism and slavery, and its slavery. SOS President Bolsonaro ends communism in Brazil, he activates." So he's gonna call on the armed forces. We support Bolsonaro. Brazil says no to communism. This is in Brasilia, Brazil's capital. We authorize you, President. This is in Sao Paulo, Avenida Paulista. We authorize you to do things in order to make sure that communism doesn't, come to our country. And the Supreme Court, Congress, and the electronic ballot boxes are, the examples and the representations of this so-called communist threat in Brazil. The Supreme Court threatens our freedom. So I could really go on, and show you a lot of other pictures of these demonstrations, and they repeat themselves in the same, issues. The way by which Bolsonaro and his supporters understand communism and how communism is linked to a sprawling conspiracy theory is one of the key elements, I suggest, that point to similar strategies and threats represented by Bolsonaro and Trump to Brazilian and US democracies, respectively. In the final part of this presentation, let me briefly explore Bolsonaro's government worldview and how this conspiratorial perspective, especially in foreign affairs, end up linking conspiratorial others abroad with the enemies within, justifying authoritarian measures. The Bolsonaro's government conspiratorial worldview is strongly linked to the international system. This is the reason why key government posts related to foreign affairs, such as the Ministry of Foreign Relations and the President's Foreign Affairs Advisory Group, are or have been in control of conspiracists. Maybe no one had expressed the Brazilian government conspiratorial views better than Bolsonaro's first foreign minister, Ernesto Araújo, who came out of the government in March 2021. This is Ernesto Araújo. Araújo and many of Bolsonaro's advisors equals communism to the complete extinction of human liberty, to totalitarianism, and argues that the only answer to fight this mortal threat is through nationalism, whose embodiment is located in the leader able to hear and lead the national people, in Brazil's case, Bolsonaro, of course. Because of time constraints, I cannot go into the archaeology of Araújo's conception of communism. Suffices to say that it is strongly connected to the US tradition of framing communism as totalitarianism, and that had been globally strengthened during the Cold War by the US government, especially by the US information agency in the Third World, including Latin America. And you can see here Nicholas Kuhl's book on the US information agency and the Cold War as a major example of what I'm talking about. Araújo argues that after having lost the Cold War in the late 80s, communists reorganized themselves and have been employing other tools to achieve their main goal. This is to say, the total suppression of human liberty. Among these new instruments, cultural tools stand out, such as the ideology of climate change, or climatism, as he calls it, gender and racial ideologies, oikophobia, the opposite of xenophobia, or the fact that one should hate his or her own nation, accepting a borderless world. And finally, with the outbreak of the pandemic, says Araújo, then came an upgraded and much more dangerous form of political correctness, what Araújo has called medical correctness, social distancing, masks, lockdowns, a new form, according to him, mental and physical concentration camps. These communist tools, following Araújo and other Bolsonaro political allies, tend to be materialized in Brazil's reality in the way international organizations, transnational NGOs, and leftist regimes, particularly Nicolás Maduro's Venezuela, have supposedly developed strong connections and alliances with Brazil political parties, especially Lula's Workers' Party, the Brazilian press, and the country's key institutions, particularly the Supreme Court. The communists' main goal is to put back local communists in power again, read Lula and the Labour Party, no matter what cost. And the 2022 presidential election is the crucial background, according to Bolsonaro supporters, in that regard. To conclude, the narrative of a global communist plot connecting conspiratorial orders abroad and national conspiratorial agents within, enemies within, even if it's difficult to assess how representative it is among Bolsonaro followers, have been employed by Bolsonaro and his inner circle as a key mobilizing tool, representing, the way I see, a serious threat for the upcoming Brazilian presidential elections. This presents similarities, I believe, with the conspiracy theories that have penetrated Trumpism and how they also pose serious dangers to US democracy in the near future. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Felipe. Thanks to both of you for those interesting presentations that set us up nicely for this conversation. So right now, if you have questions, please go ahead and enter them in the Q&A, and then I will relay them to our two speakers. I'd like to start with a question if as these other questions pop in. This came up briefly in both of your talks, but I wonder if you could talk about the role of race and gender in democratic erosion in Brazil in comparison to the United States. Obviously, President Trump used coded and not so coded racial appeals before in running for president and as president. And to many Americans, he represented a more traditional form of masculinity. So that came up briefly, but I'd love to hear from both of you on either of those questions.
Andrew begins, or?
Do you want to go first?
No, please go first.
Okay. So just like President Trump, Jair Bolsonaro has said a number of terrible things about women with respect to sex. Said, he told one member of Congress that she was not worth being raped. He dedicated his vote to the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff to the man who oversaw her torture. He has sort of chastised feminists, chastised members of the LGBTQ community. And with respect to race, he's also said a number of disparaging things about Black Brazilians, about quilombolas, people who are the descendants of runaway escaped slaves and their communities, suggesting that they don't even know how to procreate anymore, criticized political correctness with respect to race, advocated against affirmative action programs. Interestingly, there are a substantial portion of female Bolsonaro supporters. If you saw in those pictures that Felipe put up, there are also a large number of Black and mixed race Bolsonaro supporters. So to a lesser degree, but they're still there, which is rather interesting. And talking to brown and Black Brazilians about Bolsonaro, they'd say, "Oh, I don't really think he's racist," or "he says these things, but he really isn't." Or they would say that there are bigger issues at play, like corruption or violence, and therefore race and racial inequality, which is endemic in Brazil, do not rank high on their calculus as far as who they're going to support in political contests. Felipe?
Yeah, I think I'd like to add 2 points about what Andrew just said. The first point is how, the strategy that is employed by the Bolsonaro administration to dismantle what has been achieved in Brazil in terms of gender and racial equality. We know that in Brazil, racial inequality and prejudice and racism, and the same thing about women, we have a long way to go, but there were, several laws, institutions that were created during the beginning of the 21st century in Brazil, particularly during the Workers' Party, administrations of President Lula and President Dilma Rousseff, in order to try to get, a better, conditions in terms of gender and racial equality in Brazil. And Bolsonaro has employed a strategy, given that he doesn't control Congress, given that he doesn't control, the Supreme Court, he doesn't control several key institutions in the country. What he does is to nominate people that, are supposedly intended to oversee committees, work groups, ministries, and other, state institutions related to gender and racial equality, with people that are absolutely against these points and these agendas. So, for example, he nominated a person, for a very important institution related to Black people here in Brazil called Fundação Palmares. He nominated a Black citizen, a Brazilian Black citizen called Sergio Camargo, who says horrible things about Black movement in Brazil, and says that Black movement actually is the worst thing that has already happened to Brazilian democracy. And he does the same things when it comes to indigenous people. He does the same thing when it comes to women's movements. He basically fill up institutional posts and places in the Brazilian state with people that argue exactly the opposite of what they are supposed to do in terms of promoting gender and racial equality. That's the first point that I'd like to make. The second point is and I think it's another similarity between the Trump period and the Bolsonaro period in Brazil, is that we are seeing here in Brazil since 2018, when Bolsonaro was elected, an upsurge, an extremely important increase in neo-Nazi groups in Brazilian society. And even, discussions about, neo-Nazi symbols and, codes. We had, a very important episode of this, Bolsonaro foreign policy advisor who made, a kind of dog whistle sign during a Congress, hearing. And basically he said he was not making mention to a white power, dog whistle sign, but of course that he was doing, it was clear that he was doing. And I could really mention a lot of examples of Bolsonaro officials making, indirect references to neo-Nazi symbols and how these has spread out in Brazilian society, particularly when it comes to the increased number of neo-Nazi groups here in Brazil, unfortunately.
Interesting. Thank you to both of you. We have a number of great questions coming in from Mark Hoff, who works at the Center for Latin American Studies here at Ohio State. I'm going to start with his question that he asks, that's straight from the headlines. He says, could you talk a bit about Bolsonaro's response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and how that relates to democratic erosion? Mark mentions Bolsonaro has said that he's in solidarity with Russia and appears to be siding with Putin.
I can start, Andrew?
Sure.
So this is very interesting, because when Bolsonaro came to power, he made a pledge to get closer to the United States, and in a very emotional pledge that Brazil and the United States are going to get closer. And in fact, he gave a lot of priority to the United States. But what became clear is that Bolsonaro's connection was not with the United States per se, was not with the United States in terms of society and institutions and things like that, but much more connection between Bolsonaro and Trumpism and Trump himself. It's so that way because when Bolsonaro and when Trump lost the 2020 election and Biden won, Bolsonaro was, I believe, one of the few heads of state in the world that basically supported Trump's claims about fraud, the supposed fraud that happened in the US elections. And Bolsonaro took a lot of time to recognize that Biden had actually won the elections. And after that, Brazil and US relations became more fragile and colder, if I can put it that way. And it's interesting because now Bolsonaro has tried to get closer to Putin. He went to Russia, just day before the Russian invasion against Ukraine. He was extremely criticized, among Brazilian intellectuals, Brazil's media, about how dangerous it is for Brazil to go to Russia in a moment that was extremely tense, extremely critical, and the fact that Brazil could create problems for itself going there. But Bolsonaro went to Russia, even though Brazil's representatives, particularly at the United Nations, were calling for a peaceful arrangement of the crisis, that Brazil supported international law and etc. When Bolsonaro went to Russia, he basically said, as the professor who made the question greatly remind us, that Brazil is in solidarity with Russia, even though he didn't specify exactly in terms of solidarity, in terms of what. It was clear that he was referring to, to the crisis that Russia basically created against Ukraine. And I had the opportunity to, speak, here in Brazil's media and with a lot of other Brazilian intellectuals, that we have fear that Bolsonaro went to Russia and made this, huge change in the way Brazil's foreign policy is being conducted, even though Brazil voted in the UN, recently in support of the resolutions against the Russian invasion. But basically, we were discussing that the Bolsonaro was trying to get some favors from Russia, and it's not only related to material favors, but our fear is that he can or he could somehow use Russian expertise, digital militias and disinformation tools, fake news infrastructure, to try to create serious disruption in the Brazilian presidential elections 2022. Of course, that we don't have any proof of that, even though when he went to Moscow, one of the issues that was on the agenda was, digital security, which is extremely, strange, because why Brazil would discuss digital security with one of the countries that is, seen in the world as one of the most important countries in terms of promoting cyber security, cyber attacks against other countries and other societies. So the fact that this was on the agenda made a lot of people, including me, think that there was a hidden agenda, in this Bolsonaro's trip to Moscow. And also many people who were implicated in the so-called digital militias that, worked, inside the Bolsonaro administration. And it was part of the investigation that the federal police is doing right now because of the Supreme Court. Some people that were connected to these digital militias actually went with Bolsonaro in his Russia trip, which makes things even, more threatening and concerning in my view. I don't know if I could answer the question properly, but these are my thoughts on the point that was raised. Thank you.
Thank you. And Andrew, you can go ahead if you have anything to add to that.
Sure. The one thing I would add is I agree with Felipe about these concerns about digital militias, and Bolsonaro has shown his ability to use social media and fake news in order to sow discord, to increase support. I think another reason he probably chose to pursue that trip is Donald Trump is out of the White House. He doesn't have a close personal ally there, and he's concerned about his supporters with respect to truckers and farmers in Brazil. So Brazil depends heavily on Russia for imports of fertilizer, and there are already sort of fuel concerns in Brazil predating this episode. Bolsonaro recognizes that trucking and farming are key if he wants to contest re-election or create political instability following any electoral loss. Therefore, I see these moves as a way to sort of gain support for those constituencies, or at least to ensure that he doesn't lose some of his remaining backers.
Interesting. Thank you for both of you for clarifying that. Everyone else, just feel free to enter questions in the Q&A. We have another one from Mark. Mark's asked some great questions here. He asked, you mentioned traditional values, anti-LGBTQ policies, etc. That leads me to ask, could you talk about the role of religion could potentially play in the erosion of democracy? He's comments, I'm thinking of Franco and the role of Catholic conservatism in Franco's Spain. And either one of you can go ahead and start.
Andrew, can I go? So religion plays a very important role in the Bolsonaro administration for Bolsonaro's rise to power, particularly new Pentecostalism, so new evangelicalism and neo-Christians. It's kind of similar to the phenomenon that we see in the US, from the late 60s, 70s onwards. and then in a way that also propelled and helped Trump to be elected in America. But Bolsonaro portrays himself in and several of his allies, if you see social media and how he's portrayed in social media as a kind of a savior, Brazil's savior. And this is something that really speaks to several of his followers, particularly those who are Christians and new evangelicals. And there was an episode, a very important episode during the 2018 election campaign, that Bolsonaro was stabbed when he was doing a campaign, platform in a city in the state of Minas Gerais. And the fact that he was stabbed was, considered for many extremely important for him to receive media attention and things like that. But one thing that is important also about this episode is how it was employed as a symbol of resurrection, as Bolsonaro being kind of invincible. Bolsonaro has, kind of superpowers and is connected to something that it's much more, it's higher than what's on the earth. It's a kind of a super, natural connection with God, with Jesus. A lot of images in social media connecting Bolsonaro with Jesus, Bolsonaro with God, that he was resurrected after he had been stabbed in Juiz de Fora, Minas Gerais, and things like that. And this kind of narrative continued after he came to power. And even some parts of Brazil's foreign policy, it's interesting to analyze the fact that Brazil changed how we relate to Israel, for example. Brazil had, historically since the 70s, a kind of a neutral position in the Arab-Israeli conflict, Palestine and things like that, particularly because in the 70s, Brazil depended a lot on Arab oil and changed the way, it tackled the issue. But Bolsonaro reversed policy and began to connect closer to Israel. And one of the points that many analysts and intellectuals here in Brazil raise about this pro-Israel foreign policy that Bolsonaro began is how it is connected to the domestic support that Bolsonaro has with new evangelicals here in Brazil. Even though today, if we look at the data, some of the data that Professor Andrew has showed us, we see that now neo-evangelic support for Bolsonaro is basically split between Bolsonaro and Lula. Lula is regaining actually some ground, among new Christians and new evangelicals here in Brazil. And this is, I think, it's going to be a key social group in terms of determining whether Bolsonaro will be able to, to win over Lula in the runoff election, or whether he's going to be defeated, even though we know that if he's defeated, he's going to probably try to disrupt elections in other senses. So I don't know if I put some ideas for us to think about.
So one other phenomena I just want to mention, if you look at the significant determinants of support for Bolsonaro in 2018, evangelicalism was a significant predictor of whether or not you supported Bolsonaro. So things like gender, evangelicalism, attitudes about crime were strong predictors. Beyond sort of some of the imagery that emerged in the campaign, another important point I think to mention is that Bolsonaro and Bolsonaro supporters presented the 2018 presidential election, and they're doing similar things with the upcoming election, as a contest between God and godlessness, between good and evil. And when you're presenting this to voters in such stark terms, it has a strong influence, especially on the growing number of evangelicals that have recently joined the church. Church leaders have a lot of sway over the attitudes of their members. So if you look at Brazil's Congress, there are a number of evangelical politicians whose support exclusively comes basically from evangelical voters, and they're able to cultivate those votes on the basis of their relationship with God. They're doing things to serve the Lord in Congress. Bolsonaro is trying to appeal in the same way and utilize individuals and prominent religious leaders to act as a liaison to their congregations. And he's done so historically quite effectively. And a lot of Brazilians still see Bolsonaro as a politician that puts God above everything else, and that resonates with them.
There is a question that I want to get to but I just want to follow up really quickly. One of the interesting things about President Trump to me is that there's very little evidence of his personal piety before he ran for president. Is that the same with Jair Bolsonaro, or has he been sort of a practicing Christian for much of his life?
Maybe Felipe knows if he's a practicing Christian. My impression is that he is not. Like Donald Trump, he's on his third wife, and while he's Catholic, she's evangelical. When he went to Israel, he was baptized again in the River Jordan, and lots of his statements at least appear to be inconsistent with Catholic faith traditions, Catholic faith teaching. Even though he's not necessarily practicing, he's still going to appeal to constituents in that way.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's very difficult to say whether he is in fact, religious or not. He tries, and sometimes he does a lot of job in terms of showing that he practices. So he goes to religious gathering, and he receives a lot of people from evangelical churches. As Andrew has mentioned, his wife, she is an evangelical, and she practices a lot. She's very effective in terms of connecting to some branches of evangelical churches here in Brazil. But I really don't see Bolsonaro as, besides doing these kind of theatrical, if I can put it, showing of, trying to show that he's religious, I really don't see that disconnecting, truly with what he says, what he does. I think it's much more about getting, the impression that he has this way of life than really, living like that. But of course, that it's very hard to say.
Thank you for addressing that follow-up. This is just a side comment. I set up this event because I wanted to explore the parallels between Brazil and the United States in this phenomenon. I didn't know the parallels would be so close as to be the same number of spouses. So that just struck me. I have a question here from John McDowell. He asks, what is the role of indigenous communities in Brazil's politics today? And what are connections to the discussions that we've had today?
Let me, just share some thoughts. It is impressive how, indigenous communities and minorities in general in Brazil, for Bolsonaro and his allies, they are extremely connected to a conspiratorial, worldview. So probably some of you remember that in 2019, we had, famous fires in the Amazon here in Brazil, and French President Emmanuel Macron tweeted that, the world's lungs, need us to act in order to make sure, that this catastrophe doesn't go on. And this began a serious diplomatic, struggle and rift between Brazil and France, because this exactly goes into the heart of what Bolsonaro and Bolsonaristas say about indigenous communities and environmentalists and NGOs that talk about climate change and etc. Is that indigenous communities, they are basically being duped by communists, by foreign interests that want to get into the richness and resources of the Brazilian Amazon. And those indigenous communities that are duped, of course, that they don't know, but in fact, they are being a kind of, playing a role for this foreign intrusion in Brazil. And transnational NGOs, they make part of this, huge plot connected to international organizations, foreign governments, and things like that, that try also to explore, this narrative about climate change and Brazil's supposedly anti-environment policies against Brazil's sovereignty. So this is one of the things that I would like to share, even though all data, shows clearly that, Brazil's environmental policy has, during the Bolsonaro administration has began showing terrible results in terms of deforestation, in terms of every single, element that you can think of. So Bolsonaro basically argues that Brazilian agencies and international agencies, when they, they show the data, these, information basically are wrong. They're mostly interested in other issues, and they're basically instrumentalizing the data for these, terrible objectives. This is one of the things. And the second thing is how this idea that Brazil has the right to explore its frontier, has the right to explore its forests, right to explore its mines and things like that, and how indigenous communities, with the idea that they have to create, spaces that cannot be explored, this goes against Brazil's development goals and should be readdressed. And this is a point that, in a way, makes Bolsonaro receive a lot of support from part of Brazil's entrepreneurs, particularly those that are connected to the rural sector, that also believe that Brazil's pro-environmental policies that were, enacted before Bolsonaro came to power were too much and gave too much power and gave too much conditions for indigenous communities to protect their areas and didn't bring benefits in terms of allowing Brazil's economy to grow. So these are some of the thoughts that I could, point to you. But of course, many indigenous communities and people who fight for indigenous community in Brazil think that the Bolsonaro administration has been one of the worst periods, because what I said about what he does in terms of putting people that think exactly the opposite, in key institutions related to minority groups, he also did this when it comes to the environment and when it comes to indigenous communities. And of course, that we had a lot of harm done, in both areas because of this, anti-environmental and anti-indigenous communities policies that these people, put forward.
I agree completely. I think that sums it up well. The indigenous communities, because they comprise less than 1% of the population, they can't exert a strong electoral impact. They were sort of seen as a check, and Bolsonaro uses them really effectively as a foil, and says they're really what's slowing economic progress, that Brazil needs to exploit these areas, and it's really indigenous groups that are standing in the way. And beyond sort of putting people in charge of indigenous affairs that have no interest in actually protecting these indigenous communities, he's cut the budget and undermined them every other which way to ensure that these communities aren't actually being looked after.
Thank you very much, guys. I think we have time for one more question. Just in the meantime, for our audience, I'm going to put two links in the chat here. One is to the Brazil Gateway here at Ohio State. The other is the Center for Latin American Studies, just so you all can know about those and have the opportunity to check out their events. They were very helpful in setting up this event, so I want to make sure that you all are aware of their events. So our last question, this is coming from Mark Hoff, and I'm going to kind of add on to this question and we'll wrap up. So Mark's question is, can you help us make some connections between Bolsonaro and Brazil and similar situations in Latin American countries such as Maduro and Venezuela, maybe, coming from the left side of the spectrum? I want to kind of add on to that question. And I wonder if you can, the parallels, as I mentioned before, are so striking between democratic erosion in the US and in Brazil, and the personalities of these two leaders, their strategies and tactics, their rhetoric is remarkably similar. In answering Mark's question and my question, I wonder if you could talk about what are the global and transnational forces that we need to understand why we see democratic erosion across the Western Hemisphere. So Mark asks a great question. I'm adding on to it, and then we'll call it a day after that. And you have to answer in 4 minutes.
That's basically impossible, because you're talking about how can we explain, anti-democratic and authoritarian, trends.
Well, maybe you can give one angle.
All right. Yeah.
Sorry to pile on.
No. I think that one important point that we have to think about is two important points about this is how the 2008 economic crisis didn't come to the region right away, but it came eventually. In Brazil, for example, 2013, 2014, and particularly 2015, and it's connected to serious macroeconomic mistakes that were committed by the Labor Party administration, and you can see similar issues happening in other Latin American countries in terms of how this has deteriorated life conditions. And at the same time, you had this kind of rush to make sure corruption and corruption against state policies is uprooted and really taken control of how Latin America, and not only Latin America, but other underdeveloped and developing countries has zero problems in terms of corruption, and how this was connected to the decreasing lifestyle of many low middle class and even middle class citizens in Latin America, and how people began to look at standard politicians, normal politicians, if you like, it doesn't matter if it's from the left or the right spectrum, as a kind of responsible for the whole issue that it was happening. And in Brazil particularly, the car wash operation that Professor Andrew mentioned had a key role in delegitimizing the political class in Brazil, and at the same time giving legitimacy to this narrative that we had to blow up the whole political structure and try something completely new, and not only a political outsider, but someone who basically defended the Brazilian military dictatorship, Brazil's armed forces having more power and things like that. So this is part of the the answer of this very difficult question that you posed. And if I can add a thought about what the professor made this connection between left-wing regimes and right-wing regimes in Latin America, I think we can see in both of them authoritarian trends and tendencies clearly. In the case of Venezuela, we are already seeing an authoritarian regime in full blown. In Brazil, we still have a democracy, even though Bolsonaro is trying hard to weaken our democratic structures. But this is one similarity. There's many people who try to link both kinds of regimes as populism, left-wing populism, right-wing populism. I'm not so sure about whether this concept really encapsulates both cases. If I had time, I would like to explore this a little more, but I don't think that it's good to put these regimes together. And there's some importance to the fact that, as I said in my talk, Venezuela and Nicolás Maduro has an extremely important role playing in terms of this conspiratorial worldview that Bolsonaro brings to the Brazilian politicians, and the way that PT, the Labor Party, is connected to left-wing regimes outside Brazil, and they are all communists. And if Lula wins the election, Brazil is going to turn into a new Venezuela. So Venezuela has a very important rhetorical narrative, symbolic role for right-wing Bolsonaristas to, put this conspiratorial worldview, in the stage. So these are some ideas for us to think. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and I enjoyed a lot to be with you.
Thinking about the regional focus first, I would say there are noticeable similarities between what's happened in Brazil, Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, as well as a couple of stark differences. So where you've seen those leftists come to power and you've seen democracy erode, they were able to arise from similar disappointment with traditional politics, this idea of we need to throw the bums out, we need to revitalize the system. But in Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador, those political leaders, what they were able to do early on is call a constituent assembly, demand that the whole system needs to be replaced, the whole system is corrupt. And through that process of constituent assemblies, they're able to immediately start to erode those traditional checks on power. They were already able to start concentrating power in themselves. Bolsonaro didn't do that. I don't think he would have been successful had he tried. But I could imagine in the future a political leader who again runs an outsider populist campaign trying to do something like that. Thinking globally, I agree with Felipe, who's drawn some excellent connections within the international system. And thinking about sort of Maduro, Bolsonaro early on was sort of advocating in some instances that maybe Brazil should just take over Venezuela. Like, oh, maybe Brazil's gonna go to war with Venezuela, and his generals had to like backtrack and try and not cause an international incident. But we've seen the US reach out to Venezuela in recent days. And I would imagine they're trying to do things to isolate the Russia. And we're going to provide some concessions in favor of you sort of taking a back seat, perhaps growing closer to us once again. I'm interested to see how this game of musical chairs will develop, because both Russia and the United States are seeking allies in Latin America. So besides Bolsonaro going to Russia, you also had Maduro speaking to Putin. You had Cuba's leader speaking to Putin. You had Argentina's speaking to Putin. And the US is once again, is geopolitics, that they're trying to develop alliances, and Latin American countries are going to try and play these two different powers against each other in order to decide where can they get the best deal, who's going to give them the most favorable treatment. And depending on who they side with, we might imagine that they might drift towards not just the US sphere of influence, but towards democracy, or more towards authoritarianism. But thank you so much for the opportunity to share my thoughts on this important topic.
Well, thanks to both of you, and thank you to our audience for attending, for asking some good questions. Before we sign off, I just wanted to mention Mershon's next event is March 24th. It's Vladimir Putin in Comparative Perspective with Dr. Timothy Fry, talking about his book, Weak Strong Man. Thank you again to our great speakers. We really appreciate it. I think I learned a lot. Hope everyone else did. And thank you all for coming.